This is Lee Umphrey, president of EMDC, and I'm here with our friend Morgan Talty, who just finished his, is it your first book, Morgan?
It's my first published book, yes.
First published book, Night of the Living Rez, and it's really resonated with a lot of people nationally and here locally. And so Morgan, what inspired you to write this book in the first place?
I think my deep desire just to write and to tell stories and to, my belief that stories can bring us closer together. As I started writing it, it became much more, something else. It became, a lot closer to the things I experienced growing up. And it became a project that it was about storytelling, but it was about trying to position the way we look at certain issues in a particular way for a better conversation, I think.
So in writing the book, you're remembering and recognizing certain situations. Was that a hard process, or was it something that brought you resolution and good feeling?
It's interesting is when writing the book, I never really felt as if I never felt emotionally triggered by any of the events. It's only now that I look at the book and I'm like, oh, wow, I didn't, I'm surprised I didn't have a panic attack writing this scene or, or thinking about these things. I think because I was so invested in storytelling, that there was a barrier I put up, between the personal and the work.
Yeah, yeah. Early on in the book, you talk about methadone made you ineligible for native spiritual practices. I mean, how did you reconcile that? And has there been any changes in native spiritual practice to be more welcoming to people in recovery?
I think, to be honest, that scene is a completely fictionalized component. And, it's interesting when that story first came out, some people from the Penobscot Nation were like, why would you say that? That's not true or whatever. And it's not true. Indigenous medicine would welcome anybody who's trying to heal and would not exclude a person because they're on methadone. But so for me, there's been huge not for me, but for Indigenous communities, especially the Penobscot Nation, there's been huge strides in or huge changes in the way we deal with addiction, the way we approach it. It's become a much more collective community organization and, has been grounded a lot in, culture and tradition. For that specific scene, where D, the protagonist, is ineligible to participate,
yes,
was a moment for me, I think, to highlight this. There's a line in that story that says natives damning natives. And I think that was this important moment for me to draw the lens away from, the cowboy versus Indian narrative and to look at, the pain that's inflicted upon Indigenous people on behalf of Indigenous people. So I apologize to everybody. That's not the truth.
Well, and, a lot of what we do is try to help people in recovery. Any advice to people in terms of, either the spiritual practice they can use or with the kind of, we're finding that peers helping others has been a good step, but also getting acceptance from families and businesses. Any advice on how to deal with all of these barriers?
Do you mean as somebody struggling with addiction?
Yeah, somebody struggling, and we've got to help them get on the road of recovery and to get gainful employment. And sometimes there's a lot of hurdles, and sometimes it's not being accepted by other people.
Yeah, so I've never really. I'm not an addict. I was a former smoker. I was never, I was never on any substances. But I'm familiar. I've had a number of family members who have struggled with addiction and sobriety, and I've seen it. I've seen what it does. And so I know it's hard for people who are suffering from substance abuse issues to get clean, to stay clean. It's always uphill. It's never downhill at any point, at least from what I've seen. So, but for me, I've always been, the person who's had to accept the person for who they are And I think, those of us who have people who are experiencing substance abuse issues in our lives, we need to accept it's difficult,
Right.
accept it's very, very difficult and tiresome, and perhaps even a sense of hopelessness at times, that is anything ever going to get better. But two, we have to remember that we cannot abandon those who are in those situations, even when it gets very, very bad. I've never in my life abandoned anybody in my family who was struggling with a substance abuse issue. And sometimes they don't get better. Like that's the reality. But if we're not there for them, there's no chance that they ever will. Right. So it's like we have to take that chance. We have to put in that effort to love and to care for them, and to hope and to pray that they will continue to push forward and work outside of their addiction.
Right, right. So the book's dedicated to your mother and the women who raised you. She'd be awfully proud of you, wouldn't she, of this book?
She would, yeah. She would be very proud.
Good. And the women who raised you, is that grandmother and other folks? Who would that be?
Yeah, my grandmother's, my aunts, my sister. I always had, I grew up with my mom on the Penobscot Nation, and my sister lived with us, and my niece lived with us, and my mom had just sisters, so I had aunts. On my dad's side, I was very close with my Aunt Barbara, and the women that were around the area where he lived when I would visit him in the summer. So I was very much raised by women.
Yeah, nice. So the book is beautifully written and really captures adversity and how to deal with it, and has a lot of good stuff too, good feelings. But when did you start writing, and when did you know writing was going to be your thing?
Well, I didn't start writing until I was writing fiction and nonfiction until I was about 18 or 19. But I'd always been a storyteller. I'd always loved to tell stories. And I suppose I just never really knew what to do with my life. So I went to college, and, people had told me, oh, you're a good writer, you should continue to write. So I kept doing it, and I love storytelling so much. I was like, well, why not try to do this? Completely stubborn to the fact about how hard it is to make a living as a writer. I kept at it, and I just kept writing and writing. And it wasn't until maybe 2017 that I really took writing seriously. And in 2015 I had written Night of the Living Rez, the title story of the book. And in 2017 I set out to write a story collection, and what ultimately ended up as just this single story became this whole book.
Yeah. As a young boy, is there any Penobscot stories you remember that resonate, that you remember hearing one of the elders say or talk about, that kind of struck you?
I always loved the one about spirits being out in the woods at night. I remember always hearing Carol Dana and even John Bear talking about how at night, if you're walking alone and you're look in the woods, you might see red eyes looking at you. It was always creepy. I never saw the red eyes, but I always felt like they were there in some way. I love that, and I've always loved the Gluskabe stories. Whether it's him fighting with Jelson the Windbird on Mount Katahdin, or fighting the monster frog who's sucked all the waters dry in Maine.
Yeah. So besides people enjoying reading your book, is there any takeaways you want folks to get from this?
Yeah, I'd love for people to to leave this book, when they put the book down, I'd love for them to feel a greater sense of responsibility to care for one another. There is a lot of heartbreak, a lot of very difficult situations in this book, but I think one thing is clear is nobody really abandons anybody.
Right.
And, at the end of the day, we do have to love and care for each other more than ever, especially now. And so that's what I hope people take away from the book, this stronger sense of being able to love people.
Yes, I think you achieve that, because as hard as it is at some of the situations you read about, at the end there's hope and there's love and there's togetherness. So I think you do capture that.
Well, thank you.
Great. All right, Morgan. Well, it's been a pleasure, and say hello to my friend John Beer.
I certainly will.
And so thank you.
Thank you too.